On the afternoon of June 29th, 2018, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis sat on a blanket in a park in Salisbury, England, drinking some wine with a few friends and her boyfriend Charlie Rowley. It was Dawn's favorite way to spend a Friday, especially since it involved Charlie. So they'd been dating for 16 months, and she was completely in love with him, primarily because Charlie was truly like the lone bright spot in Dawn's otherwise really difficult life. So Dawn was an alcoholic who had struggled with an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder for years. And so she had a hard time finding work. And for the last 2 years, she'd actually lived in a therapeutic group home. But it was a little after she had moved in there that she had very fortunately met Charlie. Now, on paper, Dawn and Charlie did not seem like they would be good for each other. Charlie was addicted to heroin. He also didn't have a job, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. And so when they first got together, people in Dawn's life worried that Charlie ultimately was just going to pull her down even further into her own problems. But they did make each other really happy. And so they spent basically all of their time together, going between each other's apartments and visiting the park and hanging out with their friends. And for Dawn, this taste of happiness had made her want to make some positive changes in her life. Now, she still drank alcohol, but she finally got her bipolar disorder diagnosed and properly medicated. And she was feeling stable for the first time in years. She was even planning to move out of that group home and into a new apartment soon, and hoped that, that would give her a chance for a true fresh start. And because of all these changes, Dawn had planned a get-together with her family to show them how well she was doing. It was in a few days, and she'd really wanted Charlie to come with her since their relationship, at least in her mind, was a huge reason she'd been so motivated to turn this corner. Except, despite how much she adored Charlie and really was excited for her life with him, at the current moment as they sat in the park on this Friday, she actually was really mad at him. So before arriving at the park, Charlie and their friends had done some heroin and some other drugs, and being under the influence of these substances was making Charlie act like a total jerk. Dawn had just bought some new hair dye to give herself a new look for this get-together with her family. And now Charlie, high on drugs, was wasting it by putting it in his beard and his eyebrows as a joke. And so Dawn ultimately was really mad, not so much because he was wasting the dye, but because by dyeing your beard and eyebrows and all that Charlie was going to look like a total deranged mess when he met her family for the first time in a few days. And so when she expressed her concerns to Charlie, he did go and, wash out the dye from his face, and he got most of it out. But even after, Dawn still felt just so annoyed by the whole thing. It's like he knew how important this meeting with her family was going to be. Why would you jeopardize that? And so in the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, Dawn just got up and stormed off, leaving Charlie and the friends to pack everything up. She was done. Hours later, around 10 p.m. that night, Dawn lay on the couch in Charlie's living room, listening to Charlie and their friend Sam Hobson talk about life and how unpredictable and how unfair it could be. Now, Dawn was still feeling annoyed at Charlie, but overall, she was mostly back to being in a pretty good mood. After she had stormed away from the park, she'd gone to her place, and she had dyed her hair with the rest of the dye that was left, and then she'd called her mom. Dawn actually had 3 kids of her own, and 2 of them were adults. But her own mother, so Dawn's mother, had custody of the youngest child. And Dawn was hoping that maybe they could all see each other tomorrow at this get-together. And her mother had said yes, so Dawn was really looking forward to that. But at this exact moment, all Dawn really wanted to do was just go to sleep. So she got up off the couch to go grab her nightly medication out of the bathroom, and just to get there, she had to carefully step around all the junk and just sort of random items that were laying strewn about all over Charlie's apartment. Charlie was always going out and finding things out on the street or even in dumpsters and bringing those things back home. Sometimes he would sell these things afterwards, but a lot of the things he just sort of kept around. So the apartment was very cluttered. But Dawn successfully navigated the pathway to the bathroom. She grabbed her pills and then went back to the couch, swallowed the medication, and then she lay back into the cushions. Then minutes later, she was asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch a little bit before 9:30 a.m. She did have a small hangover, just a little headache, but by her standards, that was not so bad. She had not drank a ton the day before, so this was a good start to her day. Just a few minutes later, Charlie came into the room and He sat on the couch next to her and said good morning. And between Dawn not feeling that great physically and remembering how obnoxious Charlie had been yesterday with the hair dye, Dawn really didn't feel like talking to him right now. But before she could say as much, Charlie's eyes lit up and he said he'd almost forgotten. He actually had a present for her that he'd gotten a few days ago. And then Charlie, he jumped up and he disappeared into the kitchen, and then he came back with a box, which he said was for her. It was her gift. And this made Dawn forget all about her irritation with him. Dawn didn't get very many gifts. I mean, she had a lot of friends in her life who, wanted to give her gifts, but, they, much like her and Charlie, didn't have much money. And so gifts were not a common thing in her life. And so to be receiving this gift right now was really exciting. And so Dawn smiled widely and she opened up the box's lid, and inside was this clearly very expensive bottle of perfume. And she gasped when she saw it. It was brand new. She would never have been able to afford something like this, and she was shocked, frankly, that Charlie had managed to get it for her. Like, how could he have gotten this? Dawn gave Charlie a very excited hug, and she told him she absolutely loved it. And so she pulled it out and she sprayed some on her wrists and she rubbed them together and she thought it smelled so good. And then she handed the bottle to Charlie and told him to please put this somewhere safe. Then she stood up from the couch with a big smile on her face and she went to get her makeup to go get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch with her makeup bag now in her lap, and she was applying foundation to her face and telling Charlie about how she was thinking about putting more dye in her hair, maybe a blue streak this time. But as she finished her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache suddenly intensify. She winced, hoping it would pass, but pretty soon she started feeling pretty lightheaded and realized she was sweating quite a bit. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie she was feeling really weird. Charlie seemed worried and asked if she wanted some pain relievers, but Dawn just shook her head. She'd already taken her meds that day and didn't want to take more pills because it could upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to go put it back in the bedroom, and then she hurried to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. And by the time she got in there and actually began putting the water on her face, it was like her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so much, to the point where she felt like this water wasn't enough. And so she actually just climbed into the empty bathtub and just figured the cold tile of the tub would feel good against her hot skin. But as soon as she climbed in and laid down, she felt her breath start to catch in her chest. From the living room, Charlie heard Dawn in the bathroom, and he heard the sound of the water turning on and then off, and then the sound of Dawn rustling around in there. Now, he was somewhat worried about her, but he also knew she regularly had hangovers, and she clearly had one now, and so he figured, that's what this was. He also really wanted to leave right now and go meet up with his friend Sam to shoot up some more heroin, because that would take the edge off his headache and his nausea. However, before he could do that, he heard a weird sound coming out of the bathroom where Dawn was. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was, but then he realized it was a gurgling sound. And so at this point, he jumped to his feet and he hurried to the bathroom door, and as soon as he opened it, he gasped, because Dawn was laying there in the empty bathtub, fully clothed, and frothing at the mouth. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but he instinctively ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and he laid her on the floor, and he could tell that she was basically unconscious and she was limp. And in fact, when he listened closely to her mouth, he couldn't even tell if she was breathing. And so Charlie's thinking, this is not a hangover. This is something way more serious. So he ran and got a phone and he called the emergency line. And when the dispatcher picked up, Charlie frantically explained what was going on, that Dawn, his girlfriend, had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and said they would send a paramedic, but they also told Charlie he would have to do CPR on Dawn while he waited, and so they explained to him how to do that over the phone. Charlie was horrified, but he tried to take a deep breath and do what they said so he could help Dawn, so he kept the phone by his side while he straddled Dawn and gave her chest compressions. It would take an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally arrived. And by that time, Dawn had begun to turn blue. Charlie paced around anxiously inside of his apartment while the paramedic took over chest compressions. Charlie could hear the paramedic calling for more help on his radio. And sure enough, a few minutes later, more paramedics streamed inside. And at first, this made Charlie feel hopeful, like more medical support meant that Dawn was going to be okay here. But then, from his spot out in the living room, he heard one of the paramedics say something about drugs, like this could be an overdose or something. Charlie heard that and he called out that Dawn didn't do drugs, but the paramedics did not seem to hear him. And a second later, their voices got more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terminology that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one thing. Dawn's heart had apparently stopped. Now, the paramedics were actually able to get her heart beating again, but it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to move her from Charlie's apartment to the hospital. And Charlie, he just watched in panic and despair as they loaded his girlfriend on a stretcher, and then he followed them out of the apartment to stay with Dawn for as long as he could. And then before they put her into the ambulance, he leaned in and he told her he would meet her at the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens came on, Charlie's friend, Sam, appeared, looking very shocked by the commotion. They'd had plans to go to a church event that day that had free food, which Charlie had totally forgotten about. But Charlie told Sam everything that had happened and said he had to skip out on that event because he needed to go to the hospital as fast as he could to meet Dawn. But even as he was saying this out loud, he knew he really couldn't do that, because if he went to the hospital right now, he had no idea how long he'd be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he would start to get sick from withdrawal if he didn't get some drugs in his system first. And so Charlie felt trapped. He really didn't know what to do here, and he sort of felt like he was on the verge of breaking down. This was just so much. But then he remembered he had a methadone prescription at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a drug that's often given to people who are addicted to heroin, who are, trying to get clean, and this drug is used to help them with addiction and withdrawal symptoms. It sort of closely mimics what the body would feel if it shot up the drug, but without, the euphoria and the actual high sensation of using the drug. Now, Charlie had not actually filled his methadone prescription yet, mostly because he was not focused on getting clean. But as he's thinking about needing to be at the hospital all day and needing to be, coherent and being able to talk to doctors and nurses and Dawn, he thought, well, hey, I'll go fill my methadone prescription. I'll take that. It'll keep me, from getting sick, but I'll also be clear-minded so I can be in the hospital and help Dawn. So Charlie asked Sam if he would come with him on a different outing to go to the pharmacy to get his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Charlie got back to his apartment with Sam. It had been incredibly hot outside, and walking around for that long, they now were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually gone by that church event, but not really to get food, but instead to literally go say a prayer for Dawn. Now, they were back at his place to pack up a bag both for himself and also for Dawn that they would bring to her at the hospital, and then Charlie didn't really know how long he would be there, but he now had his methadone and figured he'd be okay. But as Charlie was doing this, it was like he couldn't think straight. He had this really intense headache, and even though it had been hot outside, it was like he just couldn't stop sweating. And so Charlie was thinking to himself, maybe it's the methadone. He had never done it before, and maybe this is like a byproduct. Maybe these are symptoms from taking methadone. So he decided he would just take a shower, thinking that would kind of, clear out these symptoms and he'd be back to normal. But after the shower, he felt even worse. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw his pupils were now constricted to little pinpricks. But he still tried to press on here, and he went into his room to get dressed and to finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes went by, he noticed his heart began to race. And as it raced, it got faster and faster, like he couldn't calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the methadone and heroin, Charlie had basically used a lot of drugs. But he did drugs all the time, and he'd never felt this combination of symptoms before. And so Charlie, he leaves the bedroom and he goes into the living room and he just sits down on the couch feeling completely awful. And he has this thought come to him. He's thinking, okay, I don't think it's the drugs because I always do drugs and this is not it. I've never felt this way. And he looks over at Sam, his friend, and he has this weird thought that it's like, what if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's going on here? What if I've been poisoned? And without really thinking through how or when this could have happened or why, Charlie began berating Sam, saying, "You poisoned me! Why did you do this to me?" And Sam was so caught off guard that he was like, "What are you talking about?" And he began backing away. And Charlie, he just jumped up off the couch and began to pursue Sam like he was going to attack him. But after only taking a couple of steps away from the couch, Charlie's mouth filled up with so much saliva that he stopped being able to speak clearly. All he could do was kind of gurgle and spit out this froth, and then his legs got so weak and wobbly that he had to lean against the wall just to keep from falling down. And then he felt his whole body begin to seize up, and then the last thing Charlie was aware of was his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for an ambulance. About an hour later, inside of the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room while a nurse at his bedside took his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. He'd clearly had a seizure, and now he had a fever. He had constricted pupils, and he had labored breathing. So clearly, to the doctor, Charlie's condition was very serious. But the doctor was sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs. And the doctor really felt strongly about this because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been treated that morning for the exact same thing. She'd been brought in after her heart stopped, and she'd had a lot of the same symptoms as Charlie. Now, they had stabilized her, but she'd been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. And so the doctor felt really confident in his diagnosis of both Dawn and Charlie because the symptoms fit. And the officer in charge of both cases had confirmed that Charlie, at least, was a known drug user, and the apartment where they'd both been found had been full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie got any better. In fact, they both got much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down, meaning that essential body functions like breathing were beginning to fail. Dawn was literally in a coma and being kept alive by a life support machine, and Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had declined to the point where they had to put him on a ventilator. He'd also been moved to the intensive care unit, same as Dawn. And so at this point, Charlie and Dawn no longer looked like they had simply overdosed on drugs. It seemed like maybe they actually took a bad drug, like there was poison in the drugs they took perhaps, or something completely different. But none of the medical staff could figure out what was actually wrong. It was totally anomalous. By the afternoon of July 3rd, so 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit where they were, his name was Stephen Jukes, he had officially taken over both of their cases. Dr. Jukes had seen the results from the initial toxicology screenings, and they showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. All her results showed was that she'd taken some prescription psychiatric medication, and so Dr. Jukes had sent more of their blood to another lab to test for a wider range of drugs, so he was waiting on those results. But admittedly, he was losing faith that the results he was going to get would give him his answer. Now, by this point, Dr. Jukes had ruled out some things that could have caused their symptoms. Like at one point, they believed that, maybe the two had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment because some of the symptoms you get with the gas leak are similar to what they had. But the main reason this theory didn't really work out is, Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together that morning that Dawn was brought into the hospital, but only Dawn was affected. Charlie wasn't. And so presumably they were both being exposed at the same time to, if there was a gas leak. But then Charlie, he leaves the house for several hours, so he's out completely unexposed to whatever was in there. He comes back into the apartment, and then he feels sick. It didn't really add up. If he got sick from a gas leak in the apartment, it should have happened at the same time as Dawn. Also, the first responders, when they were in there working on Dawn, they didn't report smelling anything odd. Now, of course, some leaks like carbon monoxide, you wouldn't be able to smell that, but a typical gas leak, you would be able to smell. It smells like rotten eggs. Plus, you also have the fact that when Charlie got sick, Sam, his friend, was in the apartment as well, and he did not get sick. So, all told, the gas leak theory seemed to not be it. Dr. Jukes had also briefly wondered if maybe what had happened to Dawn and Charlie was connected to this strange toxin exposure case that had come through the hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that case were from out of the country, and Dawn and Charlie had not been out of England, so Dr. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Dr. Jukes did have one theory he still thought was a good one. Maybe this was pesticide poisoning. It matched with their symptoms, and Dr. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be contaminated with pesticides. So if Dawn and Charlie had both taken something that Dr. Jukes hadn't tested for yet, then they could have maybe been exposed that way. He had told the police about this theory, and so they'd issued a press release encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case, there was this pesticide out there. But Dr. Jukes also knew that drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food or water or air could be fatal. And this was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and everybody else involved with the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by doing normal things in their home or neighborhood, that meant that basically everybody else in their neighborhood was also in danger of getting sick too. Now, until Dawn or Charlie woke up again, they were not going to be able to figure out, where they had been or what they had touched or ingested before they got sick. So Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and fast. The next morning, July 4th, so 4 days after Dawn and Charlie got sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open a door to a room where Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He'd heard they were all here visiting Dawn, and so he had had one of the nurses send them to one of these hospital family rooms so he could speak to them. He was hoping that they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have eaten or drank before she got sick. Now, Dawn's family was staring at him with anxious expressions on their faces. He barely got out his introduction before they started lobbing questions at him about what was going on and why the news was describing Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Dr. Jukes just held up his hand to slow them down, and once they were quiet, he explained that at first they had believed this was an overdose because she had all the symptoms for it. But now, based on how the symptoms had progressed, he knew overdose was very likely not the case here. Then he told them his theory about the pesticides and said he really needed their help with it. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she typically saw. Dawn's mother said she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all this started, and she said Dawn seemed fine. She had even asked to see her young daughter the next day at the big family get-together they were planning. Aside from that, though, the family said that, Dawn struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always tell them everything. And so they just didn't know much about Dawn's daily life with Charlie or her friends in Salisbury, although they were pretty sure that she rarely ever went outside of the city. But what the family primarily wanted to communicate to Dr. Jukes was that Dawn was not just some nobody the way the news had portrayed her. She was a loving mother and sister and daughter and friend, and she was really trying to do better, and she was doing better. She didn't want much. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability in her life, and that's the path she was on, and so they begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised he would not, but as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She seemed wonderful, but he had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough about what exactly had happened to her, and he hadn't gotten that. None of them had been able to give him any answer that could maybe even begin to explain what was going on. And so at this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could even do. But as Dr. Jukes headed back towards his office to try to figure out his next move, he saw a lab tech rushing towards him down the hallway. The tech was holding a piece of paper, and when he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but told Dr. Jukes he had to read this right now. So Dr. Jukes, he looked at the paper, and he saw that it was the lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And when he scanned its contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new blood test that he had ordered did not confirm the presence of pesticides or of any other street drugs. But they did show something else, something so unexpected and so dangerous that Dr. Jukes now knew for certain that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was, like literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in Dawn and Charlie's neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the doctors, all the nurses that had treated them, and all the patients in the hospital. Literally everybody. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the whole city was now in danger, and it might already be too late. And so Dr. Jukes sprinted down the hall towards his office, he picked up the phone, and he called the police. A few hours later, the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units, Philip Murphy, stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. His team had completely cordoned off the whole building and evacuated everybody who was inside. Dozens of officers and crime scene technicians were going in and out of the space wearing these big protective suits, and they were swabbing surfaces and collecting evidence. Because of those tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had sickened Dawn and Charlie, but he had no idea how they could have come in contact with it. And answering that question was now a matter of international security. Now, not only was Murphy's counterterrorism unit involved, but so were multiple other agencies, including the UK's Secret Service, which is known as MI5. MI5 would deal with the other countries outside of Europe that were now getting involved in this. In addition to Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital and were making anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie now wear protective gear. They had contacted all the paramedics and all the officers who'd interacted with Dawn and Charlie and made them bag up their uniforms and equipment as biohazards. Some police officers were now sifting through literally thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city from the past few weeks, looking for any signs of Dawn or Charlie. And others were contacting Dawn and Charlie's friends to try to get a sense of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of a park they'd all gone to the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy actually had a team headed there right now to close it off and start taking more samples. He also had another team at Dawn's place doing the same thing. And so, as Murphy stood there watching the officers in suits go in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that really, as big as this was actually just the beginning. He was going to have to be patient, because even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew it could take a long time to figure out exactly what happened and why. And so at this point, all Murphy, or anybody else for that matter, could do here was just hope that, the authorities found some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn was taken off life support and died in the hospital. And of course, that was incredibly tragic, but specifically for Murphy, he was hoping to get a chance to speak to her. She was, a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing happened, and now, of course, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, so 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, with Dawn now deceased and Charlie alive but still unable to talk, the agencies working on the case had managed to eliminate almost every location that Dawn and Charlie had visited as the source of this toxic substance, except for one, and that was Charlie's apartment. And so Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small apartment alongside some of his colleagues. This lead officer and his team were all dressed in these very heavy-duty protective suits, so they moved slowly around the cramped space as they took samples of surfaces and bagged potential evidence. All the stuff, all the clutter in the apartment made it really hard to get around. There were clothes on the floor and open bags of fabric and dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the counters and overflowing trash cans. And in the bedroom, there was a bunch of makeup and some hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, along with needles and other drug paraphernalia. There was not a ton of furniture in the apartment, but it was all over the place because paramedics had pushed it around during their response. And other areas of the place were littered with medical debris, like rubber gloves and plastic wrappers. And there was also just some trash and just kind of like random objects, water bottles, plastic toys, piled up on the windowsills. It was almost like there was literally too much in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to, identify things to be tested, something on a counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from anything else in the apartment. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time to 3.5 months before they got sick, when an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury and brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the same one that Dawn and Charlie would go to. Now, this older man and the young woman, when they came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after being treated at the hospital, they actually both fully recovered. And at first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from an overdose. But soon, it became clear that both of those things were not true. Number one, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. an investigation discovered that the substance that had been used to poison them was this very rare and deadly chemical weapon created by Russia called Novichok, a kind of nerve agent. And so 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and getting worse and worse, and then that lab tech rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results, it was Novichok, the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on the paper. That was in their system. Investigators in the spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that kind of stood out and didn't really appear like it belonged in this space, was the item that ultimately solved that mystery. It would turn out Charlie actually found the source of the poison, unintentionally. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Because Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store, he couldn't have afforded it. Instead, he had found it in a dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving excursions. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same dumpster where a Russian agent had discarded the poison perfume after the attempted assassination. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and sprayed it on her wrists in excitement, she had accidentally exposed herself and Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities suspect were involved in this thing, they went back to Russia and have never been prosecuted, and Russia has denied involvement in the poisoning. On October 10, 2003, Karen Pinnell was spending a Friday evening alone with her 2 cats at her apartment just outside of Tampa, Florida. Karen loved the Florida lifestyle, the beaches, scuba diving, nightlife, all of it. But the 39-year-old was happy to have some time alone at home by herself that night. She had a really early shift the following day as a customer representative at Tampa's busiest airport. So she just wanted to relax tonight and then go to bed early and get a good night's sleep. Karen grabbed her cell phone and ordered a pizza. Then she sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, and zoned out while she waited for her food to arrive. Karen was beautiful, with long, wavy brown hair and dark eyes. She was a former model and flight attendant who had always had more men chasing her than she knew what to do with. There were so many boyfriends, in fact, that Karen came up with nicknames like Car Guy and Doctor Pilot to help her friends keep the cast of characters straight. And Karen could get entire rooms full of people to burst out laughing whenever she talked about all these guys she had dated because she told great stories and had a great sense of humor. Karen's sense of humor made her perfect for her job at the airport, where she spent her days at work helping stressed-out travelers, and she always managed to do it with a smile on her face. But Karen's easy smile hid the fact that she was actually having a hard time in her personal life. 2 years earlier, Karen had been through a really bad divorce. Then, right after that, she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, or MS for short, which is a debilitating disease that can lead to nerve damage, blindness, and even paralysis. And recently, Karen had begun having blackouts from her MS, and it made her worry about the future. She knew that her MS would likely only get worse. On the couch, Karen watched the end of a TV show. Then she stood up and walked outside to get her mail. She took a stack of envelopes out of the mailbox and then headed right back inside to the couch. As she sat there, she flipped through the envelopes and tossed all but one of them on the coffee table. Karen stared at the remaining envelope in her hand, and she could feel her shoulders tense up. It was a bill from her doctor's office. Karen opened the envelope and scanned over the bill. She almost felt like crying. Her health insurance did not fully cover the cost of the steroid injections she was getting for her MS, and so she owed her doctor thousands of dollars. Karen had gotten a judge to require her ex-husband to increase his alimony payments to help her pay her growing medical bills. But her ex-husband was still trying to fight the judge's ruling, so she wasn't actually getting any of the money that she really needed. She tossed the doctor's bill onto the table with the rest of the mail and tried her best to relax and keep watching TV. But she just kept thinking about her ex-husband, and that stressed her out even more. Karen had been married for 5 years to a handsome scuba diving instructor named Jeff. The first years of their marriage had been some of the happiest in her life, and there were still times when Karen wished that she and Jeff had never split up. But the court battle over the alimony payments had shown her an ugly side of Jeff. So Karen often tried to remind herself that getting divorced had definitely been the right thing to do. And Karen's friends and her brother Michael always tried to reassure her that she had been right and that things were going to get better. They told Karen she was beautiful and smart and that she would find the perfect guy for her. Karen appreciated her friends' and family's support, but she knew they were subtly trying to get her to date more respectable guys than some of the ones she had been involved with recently. A coworker had told Karen flat out that some of the guys she had dated seemed dangerous, especially the biker with a serious drug habit and a bad temper. Karen had always thought of herself as someone who could handle men. After all, she had grown up with 5 older brothers, and her mother had died when Karen was only a little girl. So Karen was used to being the only woman surrounded by men. But she knew her coworker was right about some of the guys she'd been seeing, and Karen worried that her confidence around men had made her overlook some of her recent boyfriend's red flags. In fact, the biker that Karen had dated had gotten violent with her on multiple occasions. He had screamed and shouted at Karen, and he had thrown things across the room at her. Karen had stood her ground and fought back when this happened, but of course it was a really bad situation. The sheriff's department had even been called 3 different times to break up domestic disputes between the couple. On the couch in her living room, Karen flipped through the TV channels and tried her best to push away thoughts of her ex-husband, her violent ex-boyfriend, and the huge medical bill she was facing. Her 2 cats hopped up on the couch and sat on either side of her. Karen lightly scratched their chins, and as she did and the cats began to purr, Karen felt herself start to calm down. But then her phone rang. Karen leaned forward, trying not to disturb her cats, and grabbed her phone off the table. She saw the caller's number. It was her latest boyfriend, a car salesman named Tim Permenter. Karen answered the phone, and Tim almost immediately said he wanted to drop by to see her. But Karen thought she knew what Tim really was saying, and frankly, she was not interested in having a romantic evening that night. She wanted to be left alone so she could watch TV, eat pizza, hang out with her cats, and then just go to bed. So she told Tim that she didn't have the energy to hang out with him that night, but maybe another time. A little while later, the doorbell rang. Karen thought her pizza had finally arrived, so she got up and went over to the door. But when she opened it, it was not the pizza guy, it was Tim. Karen was annoyed because she'd literally just told him that she did not want him to come over tonight. But Tim said he would not be there long, he was going to stay with friends in a cabin at a nearby lake, so he just wanted to drop by to check on Karen before he headed out. And he'd also brought a small gift because he could tell she'd been stressed out lately and he thought it might cheer her up. Tim handed Karen the gift. It was a calendar with pictures of kittens on it. Karen thanked Tim for the gift and she let him inside. They would sit and talk for a bit, and then eventually Tim would leave the apartment and drive off to meet his friends at the lake. At 9 a.m. the following morning, Tim called Karen from the cabin at the lake to check in on her. Tim knew she was working that day, but she usually could step away and chat for a few minutes. But Karen didn't answer the phone, and when Tim tried calling her again a couple of times, the calls all went straight to Karen's voicemail. Tim and Karen had met 3 months earlier, and Tim had basically fallen for her right away. Even just the way the two of them had actually met seemed like fate to Tim. Karen had been looking at a car at the Volkswagen dealership where Tim worked, but at the time she was working with another salesman. But when she came back to the dealership for a second look at the car, that other salesman was not working, so Tim took over. And he had sold Karen a new black Jetta and asked her out on a date that afternoon. Tim had been a regular at Karen's apartment ever since, and on days when they weren't going to see each other, they almost always talked on the phone. So that morning, Tim was a bit concerned that Karen hadn't picked up any of his calls or called him back. This just was not like her. But there was a chance that Karen was just really busy at work, so Tim called her work phone at the airport. But he quickly found out that Karen's coworkers were also very concerned about Karen. Karen had not shown up for work that morning, and she hadn't called in to say she wouldn't be there. Karen's coworkers said that was not normal at all because she was one of the most reliable people at her job. The second Tim heard that, he left his friends at the cabin, he jumped in his car, and sped to Karen's apartment. He knew something was wrong. When Tim arrived at about 10:30 a.m., he saw Karen's black Jetta still sitting in the driveway, which was strange. If she was home, why wasn't she answering her phone? Then Tim walked up to the front door, and he could see that it was open a few inches. Alarmed, Tim pushed the door the rest of the way in, stepped into the apartment, and yelled out for Karen. But the second he walked forward into the small dining room, he knew that Karen would not be answering back. Tim saw Karen lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Her upper body was covered with deep wounds, and when Tim touched her skin, Karen was cold. Tim grabbed his phone out of his pocket and dialed 911. His voice cracked as he told the dispatcher that he needed help right away. His girlfriend was on the floor, covered in blood. After Tim got off the phone, he just ran outside and began vomiting. A few minutes later, Tim was still bent over, struggling to catch his breath, when he saw 2 sheriff's deputies step out of their cruiser. Tim wiped his mouth and motioned the deputies over towards Karen's front door, and then he continued to throw up. After walking past Tim, one deputy went inside the apartment while the other brought Tim over to the cruiser to have him sit down inside and try to calm down. The deputy told Tim that he really needed to collect himself because soon they would need to question him about what happened. Tim nodded and then put his head in his hands. About 30 minutes later, just after 11 a.m., crime scene analyst Anna Cox arrived at Karen's home. Cox went inside and saw the place was already crawling with police. She made her way through the crowded apartment to the dining room, and she saw that the walls were covered with blood spatter. She thought the pattern of the blood suggested there had been a struggle and that Karen had tried to escape from her attacker. Cox crouched down near Karen's body. She saw smaller cuts on Karen's forearms that supported the theory that Karen had tried to fight off her killer. Those cuts on her arms were defensive wounds that someone suffers when they try to hold off a frenzied knife attack with their bare hands. Looking at the pool of dark blood on the floor under Karen's shoulders, Cox was struck by how hard this woman must have fought to try to stay alive, and Cox was determined to make sure that fight had not been for nothing. She couldn't do anything to change what had happened to Karen, but Cox would use every piece of evidence at the scene to help investigators find the person who had committed this horrific crime. Police officers told Cox that the sliding glass doors in the back of the apartment appeared to have been broken into. They thought that might suggest some kind of burglary, and Cox could see Karen's handbag turned upside down on the kitchen counter, which seemed to reinforce the burglary angle. But looking at the bloody body at her feet, it was hard for Cox to believe someone would do that to another human being just for the contents of a purse. But just then, Cox happened to glance at the wall near Karen's body, and for a second, it was like everything else in the room disappeared. 3 capital letters, R-O-C, were handwritten in blood on the wall about a foot above the floor. Cox looked more closely at Karen and saw blood on the tip of her index finger. Then Cox looked back at the wall, totally stunned. Had Karen spent her final moments writing a message in her own blood? Suddenly, Cox felt like she was in a Hollywood movie. In 10 years of scouring crime scenes for evidence, she had never seen anything like this, the last words of a victim written in their own blood. And she knew the first job of the investigative team would be to try to figure out what the letters R-O-C meant. As crime scene analyst Anna Cox remained fixated on the bloody letters written on the dining room wall, lead detectives Sergeant Michael Holbrook and Larry Nelvin walked out of Karen's apartment. The detectives had met with Cox, and they had conducted a thorough search of every room in the house. Now they wanted to talk to Karen's boyfriend, Tim, who was still sitting in the back seat of the police cruiser parked in front of the apartment. When police had first arrived, Tim had been a complete wreck, vomiting constantly on the ground. But when he stepped out of the cruiser and joined the detectives, he was now much more calm, and he said he wanted to help in any way he could. Tim told the detectives that he had stopped by Karen's place the night before to give her a gift, that kitten calendar, before he headed off to see his friends. Detective Holbrook wanted to know why Tim did not spend the night with Karen, and Tim said he knew Karen had to wake up for work, which is why he had made plans to stay with his friends at a place on Moon Lake, 30 miles away. Tim said he'd left Karen's at about 7:30 p.m., and as far as he knew, Karen was going to eat some pizza, watch some TV, and then go to bed. Holbrook didn't say anything, but Tim's story sounded plausible. Investigators had found a partially eaten pizza in Karen's kitchen, along with a receipt showing it had been delivered at 8:48 p.m. So Karen must have been alive at least until then. Tim told the detectives that he had gotten worried about Karen that morning when he learned she had not gone to work. And so that was why he had drove back to her place to investigate. And of course, that was when he made his horrifying discovery and called 911. The detectives asked Tim if there was any other information he could think of that might help their investigation. Tim thought for a second, and then he looked back up at the detectives and said there was something else they should know. But it really didn't have anything to do with Karen. Tim knew investigators would check into his own criminal record, so he wanted to be upfront with them. He said he had served time in prison for something stupid he'd done more than a decade earlier. He had gotten into an altercation with another guy, things had gotten out of control, and he and the guy ended up getting their guns and shooting at each other. Both Tim and the other gunman were wounded in this fight, and Tim was convicted of attempted murder. But Tim swore he was a new man now. He was a successful car salesman, a good friend, and he was very much in love with Karen. And he said investigators were more than welcome to search him, his house, take his computer, take his fingerprints, whatever they wanted to do. All he cared about was finding the person who did this to Karen. The detectives were kind of shocked by what Tim had just told them, but they thanked him for being so honest. Then they asked him who might have had a reason to hurt Karen. This time, Tim didn't need to think. He already had the answer. He said there were two guys the police had to talk to. The first was Karen's ex-husband, Jeff, who was locked in a court battle with Karen over alimony payments that he didn't want to make. And the second guy they needed to look at was one of Karen's ex-boyfriends, who had lived with her for a short time. The ex-boyfriend was a big biker, and he had been abusive before he moved out. And recently, he had apparently begun harassing Karen about some desk she had that he claimed belonged to him. Tim told detectives that Karen was a very strong person who believed she could take care of herself in all situations, but Tim said he knew she was terrified of her ex-boyfriend, the biker. Detective Holbrook asked Tim for the name of this biker, and Tim would say the biker's name was Rock Herpich. Rock spelled R-O-C. Suddenly, the detectives felt like they knew what R-O-C meant. After crime scene analyst Cox learned about Karen's ex-boyfriend, who was named R.O.C. Rock, she told the detectives that she'd made another valuable discovery of her own. She had found that Karen had tiny bits of skin under her fingernails, likely from fighting off her killer. Tex had carefully pulled these skin fragments out with tweezers and put them in a sterile bag for analysis. And Cox told the detectives that she hoped DNA testing on these skin fragments at the lab would reveal the identity of Karen's killer. But while they waited for those test results, detectives Holbrook and Nelvin wanted to cover as much ground as they could. They had police canvass the neighborhood to try to find out if any of Karen's neighbors had seen or heard anything that seemed unusual. But unfortunately, nobody had seen anything suspicious on the night Karen was killed. So on October 12th, the day after Karen's body was discovered, members of the investigative team began checking where the different men in Karen's life had been at the time of the murder. One of Tim's friends confirmed that Tim had indeed spent the night in the cabin at Moon Lake, just like he said he had, and Karen's ex-husband, Jeff, sounded totally heartbroken when police told him that Karen was dead, and it turned out he had been on a scuba diving trip in Miami, 300 miles away from the crime scene. Investigators also discovered a strange coincidence. Karen lived a block away from a man suspected of robbing a bank just days before her murder. So police wanted to talk to the suspect, but they couldn't find him anywhere. And they wondered if the alleged bank robber's disappearance was somehow connected to Karen's murder. It seemed like a long shot, but they couldn't rule it out until they tracked this guy down. But even as the investigative team chased down these other potential leads, Holbrook and Nelvin stayed focused on Karen's former boyfriend, Rock Herpich. Finding Rock's name written in blood was enough to make him a suspect. But the more detectives learned about the 45-year-old biker, the guiltier he began to look. Rock worked at an auto body shop processing insurance claims. He spent most of his free time on the back of his Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and he seemed to pride himself on his bad boy image. Karen's family and friends said Karen had met Rock almost 2 years earlier, just after she was diagnosed with MS. And Rock had quickly become very important to Karen. He took her to doctor's appointments and he helped her with steroid injections. But the people closest to Karen were always uneasy about their relationship because Rock had a serious drug problem and a violent temper. And one of Karen's good friends at work said Karen would sometimes show up at the airport with unexplained bruises on her arms that she didn't want to talk about. The couple had gone through a bitter breakup 6 months earlier after Karen filed domestic abuse charges against Rock. But not long before her murder, Rock had gotten back in touch with Karen. He wanted her to give him an old desk he said he'd left at the apartment when he moved out, but Karen was adamant that the desk belonged to her. And so Rock's history of violence, this ongoing dispute over the desk, and Rock's name being scrawled in blood at the crime scene made Rock Holbrook and Nelvin's primary suspect. So, in the days following the murder, the two detectives took a ride to Rock's house, almost 100 miles south of Tampa, and they didn't let Rock know they were coming. When they got there, Rock was in his garage, and they could tell by the look on his face that he was not happy to see them. But the detectives told him they just needed to talk about a friend of his who was in trouble, and so Rock seemed to relax a bit. He led the detectives to his front porch, and they all sat down to talk. Detective Holbrook volunteered that the friend of Rock's who was in trouble was Karen Pennell, and Rock reacted like he was not surprised at all. He asked what Karen had done to get herself in trouble this time, but Holbrook just looked at Rock and said, "Well, Karen's dead." Rock sat there for a moment in absolute silence. He looked stunned. Then Holbrook told Rock that Karen had actually been murdered, and at that point, Rock's eyes went wide. He now knew why the detectives were really there. Rock quickly admitted that he and Karen had a totally tumultuous relationship full of what he called rip-roarin' fights. But Rock said he had nothing to do with Karen's murder. He said he hadn't even seen her in person for 6 months, and he wasn't angry at her in any way. He had rebuilt his life and moved on. But when Holbrook asked where he was on the night of her murder, just a couple of days earlier, Rock couldn't come up with an answer. He said he would have to check a calendar to be sure. At this, Holbrook glanced over at Nelvin. They were both thinking the same thing. How could this guy not know where he was a couple of nights ago? Then Holbrook leaned forward in his chair, stared Rock down, and told him that his name, R.O.C., was spelled out in Karen's blood on the wall right next to her body. Rock stared back at Holbrook, but didn't say anything. The three men just sat there in total silence for what felt like several minutes. Finally, Rock looked like he snapped out of a daze, and he began talking really fast. He told the detectives he would waive his right to an attorney, they could take his fingerprints, he would submit DNA samples. He said he was willing to do whatever it took to clear his name because he did not do this. He did not kill Karen. The detectives took Rock up on his offer right away. They swabbed the inside of his mouth with a Q-tip and collected fingernail clippings for DNA analysis. They also took his fingerprints. Then they thanked Rock for his time and got back on the road. Holbrook and Nelvin discussed the case as they drove back to Tampa, and they agreed that Rock remained their strongest suspect. After all, plenty of guilty people had voluntarily submitted DNA samples during police investigations, so Rock's willingness to do that did not necessarily mean he was innocent. Rock and Karen had a history of physical violence and an ongoing dispute over this desk, and Rock knew Karen well enough that she might have let him in the front door without a confrontation, which could have explained why the neighbors didn't hear anything strange on the night of the murder. But the detectives also agreed that there were still other possibilities. There was the missing bank robbery suspect who lived close to Karen, and there were several men she dated after breaking up with Rock, including an airline pilot who had sent her a string of sexually explicit text messages not long before the murder. So as much as Rock did look like Karen's killer, Holbrook and Nelvin knew they needed to keep open minds. When the detectives got back to their office, Karen's autopsy results were waiting for them. In a way, the findings were not that surprising. Karen had died from being stabbed 16 times in her upper body and neck. One of the wounds was so deep that it nearly severed her spinal column, and another slashed her aorta, which is the body's main artery. In short, Karen had more than one wound that could have been fatal. Seeing all of Karen's injuries spelled out in horrifying detail only underscored what the detectives already suspected. This was likely a crime of passion. The killer didn't just want to hurt Karen, they wanted to destroy her. That made robbery or any other potential motive very unlikely. The killer was probably someone who knew Karen quite well. Unfortunately, the DNA analysis of the skin found under Karen's fingernails was inconclusive, so investigators knew they would have to find another way to identify their killer. But there was something in the autopsy report that took Holbrook and Nelvin by surprise. Karen, despite having ordered pizza, had no pizza in her stomach. But there were 3 pieces of pizza missing from the pie that she ordered, meaning somebody else had eaten those 3 pieces of pizza on the night of Karen's murder. Detective Nelvin called the pizza shop and asked to speak with the delivery driver who had gone to Karen's on the night of her murder. And sure enough, the pizza guy told them that Karen was not alone when he'd gone to the door. He said he could see a man standing behind her, and the man looked angry. So the pizza guy had just dropped off his delivery and headed back to his car as quickly as possible. By the end of that call, Detective Nelvin was pretty sure that angry man in Karen's apartment was the killer. On Thursday, October 16th, so 6 days after the murder, Karen's grieving family had a viewing for Karen at a funeral home in Pensacola, Florida. The undertakers had made a heroic effort to hide all of Karen's stab wounds, but there was only so much they could do. So Karen's brother, Michael, had to adjust her bouquet of flowers to hide the defensive wounds all over one of her hands. The funeral chapel was special to the Pennell family. Karen's mother had been memorialized there in 1972 when Karen was just 8 years old. The Pennell family was a military family. Karen's dad was a career Air Force guy who had met her mother while he was stationed in Germany, and for a family that had moved from place to place to follow Karen's father's military assignments, Pensacola became an anchor, the closest thing they had to roots. Karen's brother Michael said that even though Karen was the youngest of 6 kids, she was the glue that kept the family together as they moved from place to place. He said she was smart and talented enough to have become a doctor or a scientist, but she was more interested in spending time with family than going off to get degrees. So she had chosen the life of a flight attendant and model. Michael said he felt like he'd had the wind knocked out of him the day that Karen died, and he still felt like he was struggling to breathe. And Michael knew that nothing he said would express how much he and everyone else who was close to Karen would truly miss her. The next day, Karen's co-workers held their own memorial service at the airport chapel. The line of friends and colleagues was out the door as hundreds came to pay their respects. And all anyone could talk about was how much they had loved Karen. While Karen's friends and family mourned her loss and celebrated her life, the police started to eliminate potential suspects and really began to hone in on just Karen's ex-boyfriend, Rock Herpich. The suspected bank robber who lived near Karen turned himself into police, and he was not Karen's murderer. He had been far away from Karen's apartment on the night she was killed. Detectives Holbrook and Nelvin also tracked down the airline pilot who had been sending sexually explicit text messages to Karen, and he had a strong alibi too. He was flying a plane over the Middle East when Karen was murdered. But even as the detectives narrowed down the list of suspects, they still didn't feel like they had enough evidence to arrest Rock. The guy had a clear history of violence, and his name had been written in blood on the wall, but Holbrook and Nelvin knew they needed something clear-cut that would put him at Karen's house at the time she had been killed. While the detectives continued their investigation, crime scene analyst Anna Cox could not stop thinking about the letters ROC. She spent hours staring at them on the wall at Karen's apartment. Those 3 letters, written in Karen's blood, were powerful evidence, and Cox knew that ROC had potentially been Karen's last word. In a courtroom, the dying words of a crime victim get special weight from judges and juries. It's called a dying declaration and treated as the words of someone with no reason to lie. They're going to die anyways. In this case, Karen seemed to be saying, "Rock killed me." But Cox had to be sure that was the case, and her obsession with just staring at those letters on the wall was not giving her any new evidence. So Cox did something unusual. She cut out the section of sheetrock where the 3 letters appeared on the wall and brought it back to her lab at the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. She wanted to do some more research there. In her lab, Cox looked at the letters under a high-powered microscope, and at first, she couldn't believe what she was looking at. She stepped back from the microscope and took a breath, and then leaned back in to take another look at the letters. This time, Cox felt her face flush and her hands start to shake with excitement. She knew she had just discovered something that she would never have found if she had just kept staring at the wall in Karen's apartment. And this new discovery led Cox right to another major piece of evidence. So she grabbed her phone and called Detectives Holbrook and Nelvin to tell them what she had just found. And not long after that, the detectives were confident they knew who had killed Karen. Based on Detectives Holbrook and Nelvin's investigation and the research conducted by crime scene analyst Anna Cox, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Karen Pennell. On the night of October 10th, 2003, the killer knocked on Karen's front door. He could hear the TV inside, and then he heard Karen unlocking the door. When the door opened up, Karen looked exhausted, standing in the doorway, but she was still beautiful. The killer followed Karen into her living room and then sat down on the couch next to her. Karen and the killer talked for a few minutes, and then there was another knock at the door. Karen immediately hopped up from the couch and began walking towards the door. She was starving, and she figured her pizza had just arrived. The killer followed her to the door. Karen opened up the door and smiled at the pizza delivery guy, and the killer, who was right behind Karen, just clenched his jaw. He didn't want Karen to smile at anyone except for him. But the killer took a breath and tried to stay calm. A smile wasn't anything to get too worked up over. Karen paid the pizza guy, closed the door, and then carried the pizza into the kitchen and put it down on the counter. Meanwhile, the killer walked into the kitchen as well. And before Karen could even open up the pizza box, the killer said something to her that caused her to immediately turn around and snap at him. The killer snapped back, and pretty soon the two were arguing at a full volume. Finally, Karen told the killer to get out and never come back. But the killer just kept shouting and getting angrier and angrier. Finally, he pulled open a kitchen drawer and grabbed a knife. When Karen saw this, she screamed and took a few steps back and then lowered her voice and said, "Please, please calm down." But it was too late. The killer flew into a rage and raised the knife and began slashing at Karen. Karen immediately threw her arms up over her face to try to protect herself, but the killer just slashed right through her arms over and over again. And so finally, when Karen knew she couldn't fight her killer off, she just turned and ran out of the kitchen, a final attempt to get free and save herself. But the killer caught her in the dining room. He grabbed Karen and slammed the knife into her back. Then the killer turned Karen around, pulled the knife out, and stabbed her again, this time in the chest. Karen fell into her back on the dining room floor, covered in blood. But the killer wasn't done. The killer crouched over her, stabbing her in the neck and the chest over and over again. And as he did this, blood spattered on the walls and pooled under Karen's body. Finally, the killer stood up and stepped back, out of breath. Despite the frenzy of this attack, the killer very quickly calmed down afterwards. In fact, right after killing Karen, the killer, still carrying the bloody knife in hand, walked over to the pizza box, opened it up, and casually ate 3 slices of pizza. After eating, the killer walked over to the dining room table and turned Karen's purse over so the objects inside would spill out. Then he went to the back of the apartment and opened up the sliding glass door. Maybe the police would think there had been a robbery. Then the killer casually walked out of Karen's apartment, got into his car, and drove off. But hours later, when the apartment complex had gone dark and quiet, the killer returned to Karen's apartment, and he slipped back inside unnoticed. He walked right to a closet and found a pair of gloves that Karen used for gardening. The killer put those gloves on and then walked into the dining room where Karen was still lying in a pool of blood. The killer leaned over and then dipped one of his gloved fingers into the blood and then wrote the letters ROC on the wall. Then the killer dipped his finger in the blood again, and he smeared some of the blood onto Karen's index finger to make it look like she had written those letters on the wall. Then the killer walked out of the apartment again, got into his car, and drove to the lake house where he was staying with his friends. Karen's latest boyfriend, Tim Permenter, had brutally murdered Karen. And then he had gone back to the apartment the following day and pretended to be in shock when he discovered Karen's body and called 911. Tim and Karen's relationship wasn't anything like how he had described it to his friends and to the police. In fact, Karen's family had worried about her safety with Tim almost from the moment she met him in July of 2003. Karen's brother Michael said she had called him once to tell him that Tim had tried to choke her. Michael had urged Karen to file a police report, but she never did. Karen's coworkers said they too had become very concerned about Tim when Karen began coming to work in turtlenecks on several hot summer days. They feared she was hiding injuries on her neck inflicted by Tim, but Karen just wouldn't talk about it. And even though Tim told people he was still Karen's boyfriend at the time of her death, in reality, they had actually broken up 2 weeks before he murdered her. 2 weeks before he murdered her, on September 29, 2003, the couple had been watching a TV show about people who keep secrets from other people when Tim decided to share a secret of his own. When Tim and Karen had met, he had told her that before he became a car salesman, he had been a Navy SEAL. But while they watched TV that night, he told her that that actually wasn't true. He said before he sold cars, he had actually been a pimp for a group of prostitutes, and he had served 12 years in prison for shooting a rival pimp. Tim even showed Karen the Florida Department of Corrections website that still had his face on it, along with details of his felony convictions and imprisonment. Karen had been totally shocked and repulsed by this confession and decided right then that she wanted nothing to do with him and told him he had to leave. But Tim wouldn't leave, so Karen had called 911 and police had eventually had to come to Karen's apartment to escort Tim out. In the days following their breakup, Tim had tried, without success, to win Karen back. He also had begun lurking near her apartment and going through her trash, and in doing that, he discovered that Karen was already dating other men, and this made Tim insanely jealous. And so, on October 10th, Tim showed up at Karen's house even though she had just told him not to. Karen did let Tim inside, and she had tried to stay calm and polite, but Tim had become belligerent when Karen said she did not want him back in her life, and then Tim exploded into a rage, grabbed the knife in the kitchen, killed Karen, and tried to frame her ex-boyfriend, Rock, by writing his name on the wall. Detectives Holbrook and Nelvin had always considered Tim a suspect. As Karen's boyfriend and the one who found her body, he couldn't be overlooked. But believing that Karen had used her final moments to write ROC on the wall had put Rock at the top of the suspect list, not Tim. But then crime scene analyst Anna Cox had studied those letters in her lab, and Cox found two things that made her believe Rock was not the killer. Under a microscope, Cox discovered that the letters were written over blood that had spattered on the wall during the initial attack. But the letters didn't disturb that initial blood spatter at all, which meant the blood spatter that was already there had dried by the time the letters ROC were written over it. By Cox's calculation, the initial blood spatter would have taken at least 20 minutes to dry. That meant for Karen to have written those letters, she would have had to be conscious for at least 20 minutes after she was stabbed multiple times, and with the severity of the wounds Karen had suffered, that was extremely unlikely. Cox also confirmed that the letters on the wall were written by someone who was right-handed, and Karen was left-handed. That was something her family had told police during the course of the investigation. So Karen could not possibly have written those letters. It had to have been her killer. Cox called the detectives to let them know, and that was great news for Rock Herpich, because police did not believe Rock wrote his own name in blood at the murder scene. And Rock was deeply grateful for Cox's discovery. He would say science saved his life. With Rock no longer a suspect, the detectives focused on Tim. Detective Nelvin obtained cell phone tower data from the night of the murder, and it showed that Tim had called his friend at the lake at 9:32 p.m. from a spot that was actually near Karen's apartment. Tim had told police that he'd left Karen's by 7:30 p.m. to go to the lake, but the phone records suggested he was still in or near Karen's apartment 2 hours after that. The detectives brought Tim in for a second round of questioning. They told Tim they were sure he had lied to them about the time he had left Karen's apartment to avoid suspicion in her murder. They also told him that his fingerprints were all over the pizza box delivered to Karen's home that night. As the detectives continued to throw questions at Tim, He had no answers. He just sat there in the interrogation room, covering his face for a long time. And Detective Holbrook said that when Tim did finally look up and look him in the eyes, it was like Satan had suddenly entered the room. Tim was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Years after Karen's death, her brother Michael said publicly that he didn't want people to remember Karen just for her murder. He wanted people to remember her for who she was, an engaging, brilliant, beautiful woman.